Canada Research Chair, the founder of the Centre for Environmental Health Equity. His research and teaching focuses on urban health equity, community-based participatory research, human rights, knowledge translation, homelessness and housing, First Nations environmental health, among many other things. Jeff is of Japanese, Canadian, and European descent from Edmonton, Alberta, educated at the University of Alberta. And between 2010 and 2014, he was the recipient of a CIHR New Investigator Award in Knowledge Translation around the same time as he was hired on as faculty at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And that's where I met him, when I was a fresh-faced third-year undergrad student looking for a prof to work with over the summer. And through that process, Jeff not only ended up becoming my honor supervisor, but somehow convinced me to move to Vancouver and do a master's with him on a 3-year SHRC partnership project called Revitalizing Japantown with a question mark, a unifying exploration of human rights, branding, and place in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. And I would say that's one of the best decisions I ever made. Jeff, along with Dr. Audrey Kobayashi, guided me through a master's in which we, along with many amazing community partners, used an arts-based praxis to connect the shared histories of displacement, dispossession, and human rights achievement among the Japanese Canadian, Indigenous, Chinese Canadian, and low-income communities in the Downtown Eastside, among many other communities. And out of that project came the right to remain, which is a phrase that's become kind of a rallying cry among those seeking to resist gentrification and displacement in the Downtown Eastside. And so that brings me to the present. So Jeff, along with other community partners, has been recently awarded another SHRC grant that seeks to extend the work of revitalizing Japantown by, as the title of this talk suggests, putting the right to remain to work for tenant organizing in the Downtown Eastside. I'll let him explain what that means. So, warm welcome to Dr. Jeff Masuda.
I think that was probably the most comprehensive introduction I've ever. In fact, I don't think I even need to say anything. Question period. Thanks, Trevor. And thank you to the organizing committee for having me here at your seminar today. I'm probably the only one in the room that would remember that this is an anniversary from you, sir, because it's been 10 years since I last delivered a presentation at your geography seminar series. I was a postdoc at the time over at UBC, learning the ropes of community-based participatory research, then sort of more in the area of public health and health promotion. So, in recognition of this anniversary, I hope you'll indulge me as I've structured my talk today, at least in part, as a trip down memory lane, in order to reflect on the idea that I sort of conveyed in the abstract, this in situ research positionality. So I'm going to make 2 main points in the talk today. First, what do I mean by in situ positionality? And in particularly to distinguish it in at least some ways from participatory action research, or community-based participatory research, as a concept that enables self-critique about the institutional, ethical, and discursive contexts that condition and constrain my academic identity and my work. And secondly, in light of recent trends in the public health sciences and urban studies alike, to suggest that this in situ positionality may very well be in some ways a career-limiting move, at least according to conventional registers of academic productivity and success. Which gets to the title, which is to talk about how the route that the research I participated in here in Vancouver over the last decade has led to this idea of the right to remain, a concept still very much in a sort of working draft phase that we're trying now to put to work for tenant organizing the Downtown Eastside. Because of my biological background, I'm using this distinction between in situ research and sort of more conventional forms of research that are sometimes referred to as in vitro and vivo research. In vitro literally means in the glass or in the test tube, in vivo means in life or in the body of the animal. Extending that metaphor into the realm of the social sciences of the city, however, what I would propose is that we think about the positionality of the scientist studying the organism that is ostensibly the city. And if we think about the ways in which the science of the city has shifted over the last 10 years or so, maybe longer, it's best expressed by the catchphrase which you might hear from time to time in those circles, from the science of knowing to the science of doing. We have our metaphor, both for the science and the object of that science. And so here's where the epistemic move of in situ, that is research in place, to translate roughly, can possibly serve two purposes. First, as a critique that the idea of the urban can even be conceived ontologically as an organism, a thing that is often described in those realms as something that's natural, as in a natural experiment, a thing with its own metabolism, perhaps internally coherent, understandable, predictable, rational, and of course, amenable to our manipulation. For geographers, which I think most people in the room here are, this of course is not a hard thing to perhaps oppose, or at least think beyond, because we know that place is not just a thing, it's a relation. But the second purpose is that the epistemic move pertains also to our own positionality, our view of ourselves in relation to that which we study. This is the distinction between the distant clinical gaze of the urban scientist, who observes and intervenes in the organism, versus the activist gaze that recognizes that researchers are very much, most days, some days, when we're not here, in the thick of things, in the thick of the city life. We are very much in place and in relation to this, along with all of our institutional and epistemic baggage. And as implicated is everybody else that's around us in the messy, historically incoherent, inexplicable, and often, most often, unjust assemblage of unequal power relations that are manifested in a place that is settled for some, while very much unsettling for others, to channel Nick's term for the first, probably at least a few times in this presentation. As some in the room already know, my research in the broadest sense has delved into the slow motion disaster that's been on the people of what is now called the Downtown Eastside, and has been for the last 40 years at least. That's resulted in the continuing legacy of dispossession in this place since the birth of this ever colonial city. Currently taking the form of rapid gentrification, that is the pointy end of the wider affordability crisis. The injustice is rendered visible to us in the loss of over 1,000 units of welfare rate housing with only the last few years, which 3,500 are still privately owned SRO rooms at imminent risk of demolition or conversion happening before our eyes, in fact. The steady appropriation of welfare rate housing into the market is steepening the homeless count. The record 1,847 last year, 100 more than the year before that. It's a crisis that has seen the majority of this housing stock rendered by even the most basic standards uninhabitable, to be generous, by the purposeful neglect of profit-squeezing slumlords, and a city that refuses to enforce its own bylaws. It's also a crisis of contrasts, as is evident in the images here. We've witnessed the concurrent situation this year alone of the forced closure of the dilapidated Balmoral Hotel, an eviction of 158 highly vulnerable low-income people, many of whom were multi-generational tenants, and only rehoused successfully because of the insistent leadership and support of community leaders. We contrasted this with the same insistent pursuit over the last 4 years, I think at least, most recently of the 111 proposed units of luxury condominiums only a few blocks away at 105 Kiefer, likely to be priced, if the market goes as consistent, well above the $500,000 per 450 square unit range. And this is only the latest among a slew of new market housing projects that have arrived in this neighborhood in just the last few years alone. You can see the beautiful blue developments, proposal signs all over the place in the neighborhood today. But when I first encountered the Downtown Eastside 10 years ago as a postdoc, responsible as I was for setting about doing a project in the neighborhood, the task before me, I certainly did not know where the hell I was, nor even really who I was as a novice researcher here in Vancouver from the Alberta prairies. My initial foray into the Downtown Eastside was a plain and simple photo voice project, an opportunity to engage with people in the community and, more importantly, to learn from them. But conceptually, I had brought with me my own baggage. At this time, my abiding interest in environmental justice and following the likes of David Pello, David Schlossberg, Julian Agaman, more recently Marcelo Porto, understood conceptually as injustice located beyond distributions and found in the denial of recognition of group identity, history, values, social standing, and even basic human dignity. These were, of course, formative years in my own academic development, and I was eager to make an impression. I wanted to do something out of the box, bold and innovative, and so I found myself proposing to shake up the idea of therapeutic landscapes, which any health geographers are in the room know what I'm talking about there, somewhat of a doxa for health geography, setting it provocatively into the inner city and in relation to the environmental injustice that is so evident in the built environment of that neighborhood. And so in an effort to push this boundary, my early work sort of ended up force-fitting environmental justice and the therapeutic landscape as a conceptual veneer for the project we undertook at the time. The early investigations revealed may have been at least somewhat evocative from the point of view of widening the scope of environmental justice theory into new kinds of spaces and situations. It was also mildly provocative from a disciplinary point of view, as it presented, and perhaps still does, present a challenge for health geographers to consider the therapeutic potential of reviled, revanchist, and criminalized spaces of public health neglect. But from a practical point of view, nothing in this paper was new to those, or to this project, to those who worked and support the community that lives in the Downtown Eastside today. The importance of street life, the sense that SROs can provide a new lease on life, even in squalid living conditions, that there's something more therapeutic about the ability to gather and something therapeutic about the inherent greenness of space, and that the local social environment on the street fosters a sense of solidarity in the shared pursuit of protecting a sense of basic dignity. Rather, in hindsight, my positionality in this project is very much from the outside looking in. Worse, my own interest in dressing up the familiar knowledge of the community filtered through the abstracted vocabulary of my own theoretical interests has done very little for those who gave their time, energy, and expertise to this small first project. In other words, this project was not at all in situ by this definition that I'm trying to work with. I left a very light impression on the community, and I doubt that anyone has made use of, let alone read, anything that was produced from this work. With the one notable exception of Joyce Rock, then Executive Director of the Downtown Eastside Neighborhood House, who took pity on me and took me under her wing and remains a mentor to me to this day. But the lack of practical application for my work then did not prevent funders from supporting the next phase of my research, this time framed again around another set of concepts that were becoming more popular within my disciplinary realm, health equity, a term that I'm sure is now well worn. In this next project, we were trying to become more practically oriented. We shifted toward a collective methodology, doing group photography, group interviews, etc., etc. We struck out in groups beyond the Downtown Eastside and into the more affluent communities of the city. The idea being to try to position inequity into a socio-spatially relational light, reversing the gaze, so to speak, of conventional ways of mapping and problem framing that tend to conflate inequity with deficit, and in doing so give a pass to the perpetrators that undergird processes of inequitable urbanization. We wanted to take on the deprivation map itself, which had and still has become popular among urban health researchers. We created a deprivation map, the one that you see here, but used it as a way to venture out into those parts of the city that are usually shaded in tones of blue, or in this case gray, lighter gray, using an exploratory and investigative approach that placed the residents of the Downtown Eastside as investigators rather than the investigated, and people in places and parts of the city like Yaletown, Kitsilano, and Point Grey as the objects that are inquiring. We wanted to leverage theoretical and methodological insights that were becoming more popular in geography at the time, notably the idea of scale politics of scale that may help to shift the narrative away from localized deficits in the downtown Eastside toward a problematization of the city itself. Our findings documented our observations of a landscape of self-interest, individualized lifestyles, car-dependent streets, and a sheer lack of community participation beyond the front gate of private property. We also heard time and again that these landscapes of the affluent had nothing to offer those who had made their home in the downtown Eastside, and that under no circumstances should neighborhoods like Yaletown be held up as models for the revitalization of the downtown Eastside. And finally, our efforts to be more participatory took shape in the form of inter-city workshops that had our Vancouver team travel to share their insights with communities in Parkdale, Toronto, and in Winnipeg's Main Street and North End area, where we were running parallel projects. And likewise, had these teams come to Vancouver. We even wrote a whopping 60-page community report, couching our findings in a way that tried to demonstrate converging insights around shared experiences and aspirations, while also recognizing the distinct community histories, identities, and struggles within each city. But despite all of this effort, I'm going to remain quite critical of myself and to take responsibility for what I realize has been the limited use value as a practical contribution to the struggles of the community for social change. This project, despite the flurry of activities that were undertaken over a period of years, remained very much an appendage of the everyday work of our many research partners, who gave immensely of their time and expertise to support our project and our learning, while we hardly considered our responsibility to reciprocate. In other words, the research remained apart from everything that was happening around it. And perhaps another self-critique that I might make about my own methodological thinking at the time was and is the inherent presentism of this form of health research that sees the world in cross-sections sliced out of the people and places of these neighborhoods that reflected in epistemology what is rather than what has become. And at this point, it was still evident that I had not yet demonstrated a basic commitment to put research to work. These two paragraphs from one of the papers from that work are the only instance in the publications that touch on what has become. Neither of these came out of the research, but rather through the relationships or the knowledge gained I gained from the relationships that had begun to develop with community of activists that had been supporting me. And in the foreshadowing for the next turning point of our research, this grounded expertise conveyed through these networks, and already widely understood and in fact lived by people in the community, reflect a broader historical cycle of dispossession and racial banishment, to use the more recent nomenclature of Anna Roy. Segue time. My desire for a different research positionality thus began to push hard against what has so far been the main self-interesting. And then this happened. The top record is from a 1907 passenger's manifest that shows what may have been the first documented journey of my great-grandfather, Kichisaro Kurozumi, who at the age of 41 years, 2 years younger than I am today, left behind his wife and 2 young kids to find work in Canada, listing himself at the time as a farmer, which he was, in Japan, and arriving just about the time of the infamous anti-Asian riots of that September. The second record is my great-grandfather appearing again on his entry back into Canada 8 years later, this time likely accompanied by his then 17-year-old son, my grandfather Iwao. And according to this entry, this time, it appears his plan was to remain and to settle. Call him, do you plan to settle in Canada? The answer is yes. They also yes. Kichisaro by this time was a carpenter, working at the Hastings sawmill, and Iwao was employed, likely got a job through his dad as an unskilled laborer. According to this record, or these records, the top one on the left there, Iwao had returned to Japan in 1916 to get married, and on his way back in 1922, we have the first record of their life on Howell Street, unbeknownst to anybody in my family before finding this record. More specifically, a lodging house on Howell Street, just down from Island Park. By this time, his wife Cora, my grandmother, joined him, and later that year, and they had secured a modest room just around the corner in the alley adjacent to Gore Avenue, the first home for the new community family. The arrows show how I managed to figure out the relation between that and where they were. So I don't mean to turn all of this into a promotion for Ancestry.com, but there are 3 points that I would like to make. The first is that this genealogical linkage I've discovered does not in any way give me the right to represent this community, nor claim it as my own. But it does give me insight into the consequences of dispossession in terms of the intergenerational silence that was inflicted on my family by the internment to dispersal, as well as the problem of identity formation that I had, and so characteristic of recent generations of Japanese Canadians. The second is that this ancestral affiliation has had, whether I like it or not, had a huge impact on how I am seen and represented within this community that I studied with. Irrespective of my desire to position myself humbly as somewhat of an outsider, those with whom I collaborate in the community can see, and sometimes, often, they make use of my ancestral ties to this place. And third, and most importantly, recognition of this history has given me a different vantage point to interrogate, really for the first time in 4 decades of my life, my own status as a racialized person and how that status has influenced the work that I choose to do. A starting point in years of processing since then, and enabled through my research, encounters with racism in both personal and professional life that have impacted my identity formation and my career trajectory. The point is, from all this, that my arrival in Vancouver was as a racialized, but in my own eyes, an almost but not quite white prairie kid, whose only ancestral ties, or only ties to my ancestral community, were through a distant origin story that began in the southern Alberta sugar beet fields near Taber, where I was born, a full three decades after the internment. So beginning in 2010, the circumscribed biography compelled me to encounter a community of 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation Japanese Canadians like myself, who had seemed similarly to find their own way to the Downtown Eastside, just as the preceding generation had done in the decades of Asian rights activism in the 1970s, which had ultimately led to the redress movement and achievement in 1988. Less in search of ancestors, these generations, especially those more removed from the internment, have sought explanation. They were less interested in what was than what had become of the labor of their ancestors as a basis for their activism. The annual pilgrimage, for instance, to that Powell Street Festival, which is the Japanese Canadian festival every August, is in many ways the touchstone for a community that's in search of redress in modern times. It's become evident to me that the long history of human rights activism and achievement by the Japanese Canadian community has drawn much of its inspiration from the environment of the Downtown Eastside. These histories have given our research team a unique insight into the importance of a genealogy of activism and place, of this place in particular, not as an artifact of cycles of dispossession, but as a continuous community that has outlasted the many literal acts of erasure and dispossession that have undermined it from the beginning. This is a community that has, in other words, been constituted by a continual struggle for its right to remain, even among those whose inhabitation and identity were stripped of this essential right. The struggle has been taken up by the descendants of not only Japanese Canadians, but Chinese, Black, and other racialized Canadians, whose own identities are rooted in the redress and reparations that have been won from historical erasures and dispossession. And so it's important for me to acknowledge that this genealogy that afflicts me has in many ways a direct bearing on my own in situ personality or positionality as a researcher. If we have to talk. So over the next 2 years, I began to work among the organizers, volunteers, and activists that constitute the strangely Japanese-Canadian element of the community. Working alongside my brother Greg, who was making his own forays into the community as a photographer and filmmaker, collaborating with my projects, we began to think about the task of understanding and supporting the long legacy of Japanese-Canadian commitments to human rights in the community today. This photograph of his is the earliest marker of this new focus. It's a montage that was funded by an initiative at the Nikkei National Museum to support emerging Japanese-Canadian artists. It depicts living downtown Eastsiders, people who actually lived in Europe at the time of the war, from indigenous Chinese, Japanese, Canadian communities alongside their ancestors, as well as under the escort of a wartime RCMP officer. He was actually a real RCMP officer. They're walking away from Woodward's, literally and ideologically towering in the background, perhaps receding into the past, and toward a Coast elder, welcoming them to an aspirational future rooted perhaps in a more just foundation, represented by the oft-invoked pre-colonial Musqueam toponymy of Kemale, the Maple Peace Road. So this work that would unfold would require the expertise of Audrey Kobayashi. It's her entree into the work. She has, of course, a career-length study of the history of Powell Street. And she graciously lent that expertise to our project from 2010 on. Our first foray, beginning when we received funding in 2012, was to take on the discursive cut of Japanese-Canadian history that seemed to be insinuated in many parts of the neighborhood, from city planning to arts and culture, and certainly human rights activism. But for the city's part, a large segment of the downtown east side, especially the part that we will refer to as Powell Street, became for the first time a so-called Japanese village beginning in the 1980s. It was the dream of a generation of postmodern urban planners who were bent on extricating bits and pieces of run-in history and artifact within the built environment, or where none existed, and manufacturing this history that never was. And yet, as recounted through the master's work of Trevor, this Japanese village character area was on paper the official policy of Powell Street for 30 years. It reflected a business-driven vision that surfaced an artificial Japanese landscape that elided the diverse low-income community that had established itself in the wake of the uprooting 4 years earlier. And as Trevor's work describes in very critical detail, 30 years after that, there is not a single Japanese lantern or toy arch anywhere to be found in the downtown east side, and thank God for that. But while this is a good thing, the enthusiasm of city planners to harness the anesthetizing appeal of Asian-looking bodies and architecture has certainly not abated. And if anyone's had seen the recent documentary, Painted Red, can certainly attest to that. And what is more, this scene from the 2014 city plan that replaced the 1981 plan reduces this human rights history focus of the Powell Street Festival to a spectacle of happy dancing kimono and tasty treats, which are, of course, abundant in many for the 2 days a year that that festival is. Such representations are to be contrasted with the streetscape of Powell that very much reflected a practical, everyday life that was typical of a Western Canadian community, which, of course, is not surprising given the wider embrace of ideas of Western progress, culture, politics, and social life that were a part of Japanese society at the time. But of course, this all came to a crashing end in 1942, Order in Council PC 1468. And of course, what was once a quintessentially Canadian hub of commercial activity, community life, and family dwelling was immediately and irrevocably rendered derelict by the sudden uprooting of 8,000 Japanese Canadians from Vancouver. This single act of dispossession, cheered on by the public, sanctioned by all 3 levels of government, sowed the seeds for the next 7 years of the history of the downtown east side and presaged subsequent legacies of dispossession that will return to the neighborhood time and again. But the relational link that we wanted to make in our work was not one of causation between two historically distinct periods, but rather in relation between human resilience and place. How a resilient community of support reproduces this place and reconstitutes itself within this place, even in the face of public racialization and vilification relational view of people in place set the stage for our last effort to adopt an in-situ positionality, supporting local efforts to disrupt this vicious form of dispossession happening before our eyes, by mobilizing and perhaps even weaponizing the legacy of human rights towards modern just means. So the first project, as Trevor mentioned, was called Revitalizing Japantown, with a question mark, awkwardly, always awkwardly. Began by positioning the team at the nexus between activist communities that have arisen from the neighborhood through past and present dispossessions, but with a main focus on confronting the Japantown brand that was looming large over the fate of the neighborhood in the city's planning process at the time. Largely based on Trevor's work, as well as other graduate students, and hosted by our community partners, we compiled a genealogy of Japanese toponymy through dozens of archival sources, with the task of unearthing a long tradition of discursive appropriation of Japanese Canadian culture and history that had found its way into that plan. This reductive gloss of Japantown was trying to place history in the past, reducing today's Japanese Canadian presence into tidy, compartmentalized interest groups. It would contribute to a sense of disenfranchised placelessness in need of a revitalized sense of place. But what we wanted to do was to contribute in a meaningful way to oppose these processes of fragmentation and erasure. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, we interviewed dozens of low-income inhabitants of many ancestries in those situations, approximately 90 in total. People that had lived in the neighborhood decades ago, counting their lives at the time. And so insights from these interviews, rather than being processed in a lab and so on and so forth as we usually do, were rather strategically placed back within the community in the subsequent work that we did. By 2014, our careful collation of multi-generational stories returned over to our community partners, took the driver's seat in the project through a 2-year art-making and curatorial project called The Right to Remain Community Fair. Our 2 lead partners in all this had given their grounded expertise in art-making and research curation with Gallery Gachet in the Downtown Eastside, which is an artist collective that advocates for and supports mental health survivors, and the Nikkei National Museum, that's both a repository of Japanese Canadian history in Canada and the steward of the human rights legacy of the 1988 U.S. Agreement. So over many months, we supported the work of 4 artist facilitators, Japanese Canadian graphic artist and Downtown Eastside resident Annie Mori, and Chalmette actor and presently SFU student Herb Varley, media artist and photographer Quinn Martins, and Karen Ward, also affiliated with Gallery Gachet and, of course, a community leader in her own right. And all of this was under the direction of the Gallery Gachet's Anna Lohan and my postdoc at the time here in France. So each a community leader in their own right, each of them led workshops that extended into their own organizational affiliations and community members. The workshops engaged many members of the community together in art making, narrative building, around the idea of shared struggle, of dispossession and uprooting, but also leading to a sense of a shared history, connectedness to place, and ultimately exerting the right to remain as an act of creative repossession. Here we see shots of our artist facilitators at work at the museum, facilitating a banner-making activity that spanned all of the workshops as an accessible and publicly visible way for the community to see and to engage in the unfolding perspectives of the right to remain. The community fair remained firmly within community spaces, following a churning epistemology, where ideas were formed, questions were asked, interpretations were considered, processes were revised, and knowledge was mobilized, all in situ. Through these community events, we engaged in a mode of knowledge production that was based on engagement rather than interpretive abstraction. The process directly contested the very idea of a singular, contained, and sanitized representation of place, instead presenting community history, experience, and aspiration, using images, words, and performances that are very much untidy uncomfortable, and often deeply unsettling. We put the ideas of our artist team to work in all kinds of creative ways that adapted to the situation at hand at the time. These two images are from a postcard exchange that we facilitated between festival goers at the Palace Street Festival and an encampment of 10 city activists who had occupied the grounds of Lochland Park in the summer of 2014. The city had used the specter of this camp disrupting the festival as a justification for evicting the campers. But fortunately, the Festival Society, one of our research partners, opted for political solidarity over convenience and moved their tent off of the Oppenheimer grounds and inconveniently for them onto the adjacent streets in order to accommodate and support the protest. The storyboard here, created by Savannah from a workshop at Aboriginal Front Door led by Andy Morty, speaks to the Indigenous dispossession that occurred during colonization and settlement, working against the idea existential erasure by reinscribing the continuous history of Indigenous inhabitation that has largely been left out of public imaginations and city representations of the neighborhood. This diorama by Tracy, constructed at a July 2014 workshop led by Karen Ward of Bandu, reflects her long leadership in championing Indigenous healing and wellness, a center for Indigenous healing and wellness in the neighborhood, and evoking the right to remain imagery and activist slogans in the diorama to honor this as yet unrealized struggle. Here a tableau is performed at the Gallery Gachet led by Quinn Martins, miming the annual Women's Memorial March. The tableau confronts the long history of sexual exploitation of Indigenous women's bodies and identities in the Downtown Eastside and commemorates the resilience and bravery of the women who march, many of whom remain in place despite the constant encroachment of violent predators into the community. And finally, here's a workshop we held in partnership with the first SRO convention that would go on to found the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative, a new and vigorous, multifaceted approach to organizing SRO tenants to fight for their legal rights to dignified and safe housing, and led by Wendy Peterson, a longtime Downtown Eastside organizer. The Right to Remain banner would prove to be the public face of the community fair and was created over the course of several of these workshops and literally took to the streets and heralded the presence of our research in the community, connecting narratives and places, and held by activists and flown in solidarity with political action such as this housing march that took place after the first convention. And then all of this work would culminate through 2015 in a series called the Right to Remain exhibitions, supported in part by another Sherpa Connections grant, but more importantly, supported by the significant in-kind work of our partners. These exhibits were a curatorial synthesis of the previous 3 years of our archival research, multi-generational interviews, and community workshops. At their foundation are 4 dimensions of the right to remain that were revealed through a prolonged and dialogical process of engagement, art making, and the churning approach to working with data. The Right to Remain became the conceptual grist for understanding and communicating our project. Over the course of the next year, a meta-narrative was generated from the ongoing dialogue between interview, transcripts, and community workshops. How am I for time? Running out? Okay, I'm going to skip the meat of that first and just go on to the end here. So the exhibits have provided another more in situ route for these ideas, materials, and expressions to take space within and take up space within and beyond the community. The next several slides, which I'll just fly through here, don't do justice to either the impact of the exhibits themselves nor the discussions that were generated within these spaces. But they do reflect the talent and hard work of the design and curatorial teams, which include Kristen Lance and Carol Sepkin at Gallery Gachet, Beth Carter and Sherry Kajiwara at the museum, as well as probably countless others. These banners that you see here hung at Gallery Gachet are meant as a critique to those typically actually mounted by the BIA on streetlights in the downtown Eastside. But these ones give voice to the stories, that is, our interview excerpts of inhabitation and rights making in the downtown Eastside, both past and present. This is an inter-community exchange that we held at Rigour that brought together a group of Japanese Canadian human rights activists together with Downtown Eastside inhabitants and facilitated by the artist facilitators. It was a powerful moment of sharing and strengthening our relationships. The banner continued to make presence. It was always and remains front and center as a symbol to set the scene and to bring the community into the gallery space and to make a place. In November of 2015, the exhibit traveled to the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, where over 3 months it brought the message of the right to remain to a wider and very different audience. This is a venue that is aptly symbolic of Japanese Canadian rights-based activism and achievement, as well as an appropriate place for this community, that is the Japanese Canadian community, to connect with elements of their redress legacy that still work in the downtown site today. And on the day of the launch, as you can see in this photo, we offered a door-to-door bus service for residents of the downtown east side with stops at Hastings and Main, as well as Oppenheimer Park. The expansive space of the museum, while a little less intimate than Gallery Gachet, was quite affirming and empowering for the team members. Here are the artist facilitators reflecting on their knowledge for the audience of opening day, with the incomparable Autumn Siegel presiding over the room. This exhibition became a space to celebrate the human rights legacy of the community by showcasing both life-size processes and perspectives of hundreds of Downtown Eastside residents and allies gained through the community fair. The exhibit coalesced historically disparate narratives, curated in artwork, interviews, photographs, archival records, and all into a unified meta-narrative, folding together countless stories of Power Guy and the Downtown Eastside, from Indigenous, Japanese, Canadian, and other past and present inhabitants. And in a nod to our upcoming present work, the centerpiece of this exhibit was a 10 by 10 foot mock-up of a single room occupancy unit in a building called the Morimoto. This unit has been inhabited since the 1980s by Tom, who's shown in this photo here, standing with Greg, my brother. It's hard to see there on the left. The setting of the room recalls its ancestral origins as a Japanese Canadian built and inhabited room until the war. The boxes in the space stand in for Tom's furniture in its proper dimensions to give a sense of the limited space that actually exists in there. But the white surfaces instill a sense that this room has undergone many incarnations. The most recent of which is evoked through Greg's 3D panoramic photo that places the observer in Tom's home in its present state. Yet, when transported into the museum, symbolically joins Tom together with the previous inhabitants, long since departed. And finally, the project as a whole culminated in a documentary film produced by Greg, who was embedded into our work over the 3 years that we did it. His film, taking the title Right to Remain, aired last year on CBC, but has also been screened in numerous Vancouver area venues and on the platforms once in university classrooms across the country, hopefully, and where we hope to reach hundreds, if not thousands, of students and community members with this message of the long-standing legacy of human rights in the Downtown Eastside. So in the Right to Remain, still in a working draft, we think that we have found a useful vocabulary that cuts across the many layers of ancestral ties, legacies of activism, and placemaking efforts in the Downtown Eastside. It's a vocabulary that transcends the myriad differences that have fractured urban spaces across divisions of class, gender, ancestry, indigeneity, disability, and so on. The creative pursuit of a right to remain gives all urban inhabitants a recognitional politics premised on the dignified inhabitation of the city. Not merely a legal or even a social right, we find the right to remain to be an aspirational expression of the necessary political, cultural, existential, and material resources that are necessary to inhabit the city and to participate meaningfully in urban life. As an aspirational right, it's not unlike other rights to housing, that's not going to be a real right, to health, food, and so on, that are likewise outside of formal constitutional recognition, yet widely held as yet unrealized societal norms. In And as our best effort yet to position ourselves as in situ researchers, we realize that the right to remain registers most clearly when it's left in place, simply because, unlike previous incarnations of our research findings, this concept emerged from place. What we might think of as an experimental research process, that which I've described over the last 40 minutes or so, those that invoke creative and critical talents that dwell in the downtown SRO, have always been a natural part of the lexicon of activism in the pursuit of rights through political action. So as we embark on our current project, now joined by Longley and Sarah DeLeo, we aspire to take the next step, to put the right to remain to work for tenant organizing in the SRO hotels. Working in situ has brought both us researchers and partners into close collaboration with the Downtown Eastside SRO Collaborative, who now are kind enough to host us in their office spaces down on Kiefer in the heart of Chinatown. We're working with new ideas, such as protest haiku, participatory archival research, for example, as well as SRO interviews with SRO tenants to transform research into a form of organizing that supports tenant-led efforts to tackle the worst among the nearly 90 SROs that are still under private ownership. To engage with existing instruments such as the Landlord Tenant Board, ultimately with the goal of changing the ownership structure of these hotels and get these long neglected housing resources up to code. And as a concluding thought, it's worth reflecting on how this research positionality becomes increasingly risky from a conventional academic point of view. Contributions we wish to make in the years to come favor time spent on relationships, on time taking subordinate roles, and taking on tasks that support community needs and priorities, that lend our institutional authority in ways that can possibly influence unequal power relations, and ultimately to produce deliverables that may very well remain largely outside of conventional systems of academic recognition, those that would never make it onto the CV. So to conclude, we remain in a place that we are fully committed, at least in principle, but are constantly aware of the limits of our value in the growing movement to unsettle the city, to use next term of last year. In an epistemic environment that has increasingly valorized big data interventions and fast policy fixes, we find our approach becoming smaller and slower, being the best suited to the real work, the real human rights achievements that are happening on the ground.
We have time for some questions.